What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the Season 2 finale for the cultural abomination known as The Lord of the Rings of Power. Somehow this show managed to save the worst for last, exploring new lows that make some of the other episodes this season seem not quite as horrendous in hindsight, but for the moment, put aside any and all concerns that fans of J.R.R. Tolkien's books might have, and let's just wrestle with this show as like a big, dumb, trashy pop culture experience designed for the widest possible audience. But even then, it is a total failure. Like, the story construction is just sloppy as hell, the writing is laughably incompetent, and apart from the battle in Eregion, we're basically left with a season where nothing happened. Like, if you were to take all the storylines involving Isildur, or Theo, or Elendil, or Miriel, or Nori, or Poppy, and now Gandalf. We can't call him not Gandalf anymore. But if any of those plot lines were to just disappear entirely, would it negatively impact the show in any way? Because these characters, they're just non-entities that nobody gives a fuck about, apart from angry nerds like myself, whose hate for the show is only matched or surpassed by my love of Tolkien's books. I've been reading up a storm this past week, and I went back and revisited all the material I could find on Galadriel and the Balrog and Moria, and that I knew, both characters were obviously going to be featured prominently in this final episode. And what's incredible to me is how after decades of my life where I've been reading this material and rereading certain passages, Tolkien's prose is just more awe-inspiring than ever, whereas this show, it'll largely be forgotten by this time next week. I mean, due to the the 3 or 4 week delay with the Nielsen ratings, people will be discussing this show and its success or lack thereof, and whether or not the ratings go up or down for the next couple of weeks. But as far as like the story and the emotions and the characters, this show is just going to be tossed in the dung heap of all the other crappy TV shows being made today. But it has the distinction of being the most expensive show ever made. I mean, this show is just a fucking joke. Everybody involved with it, I shouldn't say everybody involved with it. I'm sure there's some people involved on the show that want to make a great show. But all the key creators, all the key writers, all the key directors, and especially the showrunners, they should all be ashamed of themselves. But let's slow down and take this episode's flaws one at a time. And the first point I want to make is that this show has made abundantly clear that the world of Middle-earth and all the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, it's not a sandbox that invites other storytellers in to tell their own unique stories. Like, either adapt his stories, like, to the best of your ability or lack of ability, or just fuck off, leave it alone. There are creations out there that are a sandbox. I brought this up before. Like, if you look at DC Comics and Marvel Comics, where you have these like kind of ongoing continuities where over many, many decades, hundreds, if not thousands of different writers and artists can come in, tell their own stories, and then push on and write books or make movies or do whatever. But those are sandboxes that invite storytellers to come in and do an arc on a character, or sometimes run a character for decades. Tolkien is not Marvel. Tolkien is not DC. And if you try to turn it into now I'd argue that even Star Wars struggles as a sandbox to invite other storytellers in, because the moment you kind of veer away from George Lucas's creations, you're in quicksand, unless you're just like a brilliant storyteller in your own right. I just feel like the best course forward for so many creators is make up your own novels, make up your own shows, make up your own movies, like make up your own anything. Take inspiration from the great writers of the past, take inspiration from the great filmmakers of the past, but just leave their works alone and just let them remain kind of unsullied and unspoiled. Especially when you're dealing with a staff of writers that are just fucking hacks who will take every shortcut imaginable in order to achieve whatever their goals might be. Like one of the big shortcuts I noticed this episode is that every character in the show seems to be like part of the audience for the show. It's almost like they're following the show. Everybody seems to know all this information about the Nine Rings. Everybody in the show seems to have all this information about Sauron. Like, the writers of this show can't even keep track of their own continuity, like their own crummy continuity riddled with shortcuts that they've already created. Like, forget about Tolkien's continuity. The writers can't even remember, like, who knows that Sauron exists? Like, where has he been? Like, somehow Nori and Poppy and all the Sturs and the Dark Wizard and, Gandalf and all these characters way the hell away are somehow like up to speed on everything that's going on, hundreds if not thousands of miles away. It just makes no fucking sense. Even on the island of Numenor, which is way the fuck out in the ocean, somehow they're all like up to speed on what Sauron's up to and that sort of thing, and like, declaring that anybody and everybody who is faithful to Miriel is somehow in league with Sauron. I mean, it's just complete and total nonsense. It's so sloppy, it's so incoherent, and I feel like the only way you can enjoy this show is if you have no memory of what's come before and you don't care what it's going, because the show's constantly creating new problems for itself. But I guess the writers of the show, they don't even regard it as a problem because they're just going to wash the slate clean. Anything that's inconvenient, they'll just ignore or forget about, and they'll just keep pushing forward. Like, take Gandalf and Sauron this episode. They've created so many new problems for themselves because they've depicted Sauron as a villain in the Second Age. And for people who are keeping track of these things, the five wizards didn't arrive in Middle-earth until 1,000 years into the Third Age. Like, after Sauron got the ring cut from his hand by Isildur, and he basically was just like a shadow, like kind of like gathering strength again for a long time. As he started to take shape again, that's when the five wizards initially arrived. But this show has introduced the five wizards in the Second Age, meaning that they're going to have to find stuff for them to do for the rest of the Second Age. Like, when you read about the history of the Second Age and the last alliance of elves and men, how come Gandalf wasn't a part of it? How come Saruman wasn't a part of it? But now that they're here, they need to actually find a way to include them without like upsetting the status quo. And also, they've introduced Saruman as a villain. Saruman was a good guy for a very long time. Like, only by studying the methods of Sauron and the methods of the creation of the rings for many, many centuries was he slowly corrupted and kind of like filled with greed and ambition. But Saruman the White was Saruman the White for a long time before it became Saruman of many colors. But because the writers of the show cannot write, in spite of writing being their official occupation, they wanted to steal the scene from Fellowship of the Ring where Ian McKellen and Christopher Lee start arguing about whether or not they should replace Sauron and so on and so forth. But they basically wanted to repurpose that scene. Like, well, then we have to just go ahead and just reveal the fact that Saruman is evil. But like, if you read the Fellowship of the Ring or you watch Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf looked up to Saruman right up until the moment where he realized, oh shit, I have fallen into a trap. But I guess they're just assuming that somehow over the centuries that Gandalf will forget the fact that Saruman's already revealed all of his goals and intentions, hundreds if not thousands of years earlier. It just drives me crazy because, as I've said before, the history of Tolkien's world, it's very elaborate, it's very sophisticated, and it's very complex. And if you start tugging at little pieces, it's like a big giant Jenga building, or it all falls to pieces. You can't just start rearranging the history because the history, everything builds on what came before. And if you start disregarding what came before, well, then nothing that is to come will make any sense. And in yet another example of this show forgetting its own continuity that's been invented for the show, Saruman's basically talking to Gandalf about how they're old friends and how they were sent over to Middle-earth in order to fight the rising threat of Sauron, which is similar to why they come over in the Third Age in the books. But in the context of this show, Sauron has not been a threat yet. He's basically just like been this wandering douchebag who, like, no one really even knows that he exists apart from a handful of people. So why would the Istari or the five wizards been sent over to fight this threat that in the context of this show doesn't exist yet? Like, once again, they want the convenience of pulling from the books and Peter Jackson's trilogy, but they're forgetting that they haven't done the work to set up Sauron as a threat, and so nothing computes. Like, the scenes don't go together. It just seems like 3 or 4 separate shows that are all kind of loosely related, and the writers can't even keep track of what has come before. But let me get off my high horse and slow down and look at my notes and actually try to take these scenes one at a time. So let's start with the dwarves. First and foremost, putting on a dwarven ring doesn't turn you into like a raging psychopath, as Tolkien frequently stated in the books. Because dwarves are so willful and proud and stubborn, even the dwarven rings really, like, they struggled to kind of like change the dwarves, but so much it made them perhaps a little bit more avaricious and a little more greedy. But it didn't turn them into just these fucking lunatics like we see with King Durin. And we have this weird situation where, he beats a hole through the wall and the Balrog wakes up. For people who are keeping track of these things, the Balrog slept through the entire Second Age and never was awakened even once. But we have this ridiculous scene where the Balrog, whips his leg, but somehow he only like slides like a few feet. And then we have this, this kind of chubby old man somehow leaping 30 feet into the air when he no longer has the ring on, and clashing blades. Like, the Balrog's sword would have just gone right through him like he was made out of butter. But also, it's not like the Balrog is like a big, like, rampaging animal. The Balrogs are basically from the exact same race as the five wizards. Like, you have the Valar, and then you've got the Maiar, which are like one level down, of which Sauron is also a member of those ranks. The Balrogs can think. and they can be strategic. And like, it's not like that Balrog just like was born down there and doesn't know how to get out. He came there deliberately at the end of the First Age to basically kind of rest and hide after Morgoth had been overthrown. But he's not just going to hang out down there. Like the Balrog is capable of exploring Khazad-dûm. And at the end of the episode, when the dwarves are debating matters of succession and who should receive the 7 rings and that sort of thing, it's like, there's a goddamn Balrog on the loose. He's not just going to chill down there and let you do your thing. Like, anyway, it's just, once again, nobody in the show seems to remember what's come before, but at the same time, they seem to be aware of everything that's happening all at once. Like I said, all the writers do on this show is take every shortcut they can in order to get to the next scene that's popped into their head. But nothing matters. Nothing will last. Nothing has any stakes. It's just, like I said before, sloppy. But I should add, because I do have the ability to remember what has come before, I still haven't forgiven the show for that ridiculous episode in season 1 where they tried to create an origin story for Mithril involving a Balrog. That might be the dumbest piece of entertainment that the show has put forward yet, apart from maybe this season 2 finale. But as far as the storyline in Rune is concerned, let's forget about the fact that Saruman has already revealed himself to be a villain in spite of the fact that he was on the White Council for thousands of years in the Third Age. You know, he was an ally of Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf. Like the White Council, he was the leader of the White Council. But let's set that aside. It just, like that set where they're all interacting, it looked like it had been built by children. It looked like it had been shot by children. At one point, Saruman, the Dark Wizard, he, one of his allies, he kind of flings him backwards and he hits his head on this little wooden stake. But it all just seems so cheap and so rushed. How is this show the most expensive show ever made, but at the same time looks like it was made for like $100? I just don't understand that at all. But let's look on the bright side. It looks as if they might be writing Nori and Poppy and the rest of the hobbits out of the show. I mean, they're all going to take off and do whatever now. But like, if they wanted to get rid of those characters entirely, they could. But they had, I mean, maybe my least favorite scene this entire episode is when, I always forget, is it Nori or Poppy? It was Poppy. They try to give Poppy a Samwise moment, just like at the end of the Two Towers movie, when Samwise is basically acting like the narrator of the franchise, talking about like there are many opportunities for heroes and stories to turn back, only they didn't. You know, there's some good in this world and it's worth fighting for. But it's just this kind of like vapid, flowery nonsense that you would find on a greeting card. People always try to say nothing, but in the most elaborate way possible in this show. Like, they try to make it sound like poetry, but it just comes across as hollow. But maybe this show will finally just let Nori and Poppy go away and have nothing to do with the story moving forward. That would definitely be an improvement. They've got their window. Let's see if they'll do it. I mean, assuming at this point that they even get a season 3. I know the writers of the show are working on season 3, but Amazon has not officially given it the green light. Or if they have, I did not see that news. And just to put to bed all that stuff involving their storylines, I about projectile vomited out of my goddamn nose when one of the stewards said, like, you know, thank you kindly, Grand Elf, as he was leaving and saying goodbye to Gandalf, not Gandalf, a.k.a. the Stranger. I was like, oh my God, I really can't believe that they're using that as the origin for Gandalf. I mean, he's had many names, like, you know, my favorite's Mithrandir, which the elves like to call him, but I can't believe the entire season was just about Gandalf finding his stick and finding his name. I mean, this show's been going for years at this point. Like, when are they actually going to, like, come up with something for this character to do, apart from looking for a stick in his name? But also, if they wanted to, they could just let Saruman and Gandalf vanish from the story entirely, because nothing in the Second Age involves them, and nothing for the first 1,000 years in Middle-earth involves them. If they wanted just to say, like, they just kind of wander and drift and do research, they could kind of start getting back to something resembling the official chronology of the timeline, but I'm sure the writers will cook up something totally absurd for both characters to do next season if they get it. And while we're on the subject of worthless storylines, let's talk about what went down in Numenor as well as in their colony on Middle-earth. But it seems like that storyline's on a completely different timeline than the events going on in Eregion. Like, the events in Eregion, like, we're seeing like a few days unfold, and it's supposed to be all, you know, so tense, and they're cross-cutting with all these other storylines trying to raise the tension. But it takes time to go to and from Middle-earth and Numenor, and yet somehow people are just able to teleport over there with no problem whatsoever. And in yet another of one of the most ridiculous moments, the entire episode, Farazan's douchebag son arrives, and Theo is trying to introduce himself, and he's like, I'm Theo, you know, son of what the fuck's his mother's name? Hang on. I can't remember. I used to know. Oh, god damn it. Bronwyn, here it is. So in one of the most unintentionally funny moments of the entire season, Theo walks up to Farazan's douchebag son. He's like, I'm Theo, son of Bronwyn. And he just kind of walks on by and ignores him. And somebody else like, did you not hear him? He is Theo, son of Bronwyn. Like, Theo and Bronwyn are like random people who live in a fucking village in the middle of nowhere. Like, they're not. It's not supposed to be like, oh, this is Elrond, or this is fucking Gil-galad, or this is Galadriel. Like, they are non-entities. These characters do not matter. But what actually would have made the show at least funnier, it wouldn't have made it better, but if the douchebag son had just been like, be silent, and it just lopped off Theo's head just to get Theo out of the story, because Theo does need to go bye-bye. But anyway, goddamn, I'm getting tongue-tied trying to express all my frustration and all my rage over all the ridiculous storylines this episode. Suffice to say that Isildur basically now is taken prisoner, and back in Numenor, Elendil has fled to the west of the island, whereas they finally at least have acknowledged that he has another son, Anarion, who lives there. And before he goes, what's her face? Muriel gives him the blade of Narsil, which will obviously be stepped on by Sauron and broken at the end of the Second Age, and then the shards will be preserved in Rivendell for many, many years until Aragorn is able to kind of take up the sword again. In the book, they just reforge it after the Council of Elrond. In the movies, obviously, Elrond delivers the sword to him, but that is the sword wielded by Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. But I should admit that one of the reasons this episode was potentially so frustrating to me is that last night I was rereading Chapter 7 from Fellowship of the Ring, the Mirror of Galadriel, and that's the scene, or the chapter where Frodo has his fantastic scene with Galadriel, where he basically offers the ring to her, and she is tempted to take up the ring and become a Dark Queen. But the way she's written in that chapter, she's so wise and so mysterious. And people need to keep in mind, Galadriel's been around long enough. In the context of Tolkien's books, she is older than the sun and the moon. Like, the elves were created before the sun and the moon, and they were around for a very, very long time. And when her people were fleeing from the Undying Lands back to Middle-earth, pursuing Morgoth, who had stolen the Silmarils, at that time, the sun and the moon still hadn't been invented. And when her people, led by Fingolfin, finally arrive in Middle-earth, that's when the sun first rises. But she's been around for a very, very, very long time, and she's incredibly wise, incredibly powerful. And I love how, like, when Frodo's looking into the Mirror of Galadriel, he thinks of it as magic. She's like, well, you might call it magic, but you seem to use that same word for talking about, like, the craft of the enemy. Like, for her, it's just, like, what she does. She's able to just present people with visions and that sort of thing. But the chapter is just stunning to read. And then you compare that to Galadriel of this episode, where I finally realized what I find so bewildering about the expressions, or the expressions she likes to make when confronting Sauron. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I watch them all grow up. And anytime a toddler is wearing a diaper and they're trying to take a dump, but they can't get it out, and they kind of make these like strained expressions, those are the expressions that Morfydd Clark makes anytime she's trying to look tough when confronting Sauron. It's like, stop squeezing your face like that. People who are badasses are calm, cool, and collected and lethal. But like, the more Morfydd Clark reaches for like this kind of warrior spirit that she's trying to embody, the more ridiculous she becomes. And I just started howling with laughter while she was having that ridiculous sword fight with Sauron. Because what it reminded me of is some of the lightsaber battles that I've seen at New York Comic-Con and San Diego Comic-Con, where you have a lot of cosplayers, like people will show up dressed as Darth Maul or Obi-Wan or whatever, and they enjoy having their little plastic sword fights. But when cosplayers are fighting, they're not actually trying to hit each other. They're trying to keep the fight going, and so they'll actually aim for each other's swords as opposed to aiming for each other. So it's like, oh, y'all just want to play, like, pretend to be Jedi. And I feel like that's what Galadriel and Sauron were doing this episode. They wanted to show off their spins. They wanted to show off all their elaborate moves. But they weren't actually trying to kill each other. They just wanted to keep the fight going. I can't stand that kind of choreography. Like, let it be savage. Let it be ruthless. Let people actually try to stab each other and kill each other. Like, don't just have choreography for its own sake. But the positive side to some of these scenes involving the Siege of Eregion is that some of these worthless characters started getting killed off. And for me, any character who is not in Tolkien's books is worthless. Like, anything they do is destined to be completely inconsequential, because unless the show's planning on completely, totally rewriting the history of Tolkien's world, like they can't do anything that would like fundamentally change the status quo. So Adar, who briefly gets to turn back into a beautiful elf when he puts on Galadriel's ring. So it turns out he's a nice guy all along. He just wants peace, love, and understanding, and he gives the ring back to Galadriel. And then, the orcs team up and kill him. Like, they never even show us how Sauron convinces the orcs to change sides, because you have to remember, all the orcs are here in Eregion to capture and kill Sauron, and yet suddenly they're all now working for him and kill Adar. But whatever. But also the orc who's been kind of set up this whole season, who just wants to have, once again, peace, love, and understanding, and make babies and that sort of thing. He's, a backstabbing piece of shit, or at least he was all along, but at least he also gets killed too. He's off the chessboard. Adar's off the chessboard. Like, slowly but surely, this show is killing the worthless characters. Now we just need to kill Theo, Nori, Poppy, whatever the name of Elendil's daughter is, because she doesn't come from the books either. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, every character who's in the show who is not written by Tolkien, they can all burn in the fires of Mount Doom. But even the characters that were created by Tolkien, they're not much better. Like Gil-galad, every time he speaks, he comes across like a character in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. He's like, "How about you?" and "Vile traitor." Like, everything's so grandiose and so absurd and over the top. And yeah, Gil-galad, he's supposed to be the High King of the Noldor. He's supposed to be one of the most badass elves you can possibly imagine, that all the other elves look up to. But he is just he's a buffoon. He's a total dumbass. But sadly, Arondir, or Arandir as they say, is still alive. I thought he got killed perhaps at the end of last episode, but he's going to stick around for a little while longer. But getting back to the idea of this show just being a bad show, irrespective of what it does to Tolkien's books, the writing is just fucking awful. Like when Galadriel and Sauron are having their big face-off, and she's like, "You wish to heal Middle-earth. Heal yourself." It's like, what the fuck does that even mean? I mean, it's written by fucking morons. And, well, I can't resist getting nerdy again, but like somehow the crown of Morgoth is being used by a weapon repeatedly throughout that fight, wielded by Sauron. But the crown of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, after the crown was taken from his head, his feet were chopped off, and they turned his crown into a collar, and they took him away. Like, Morgoth's crown should not just be a prop that's lying around. If Sauron wants to make his own crown, more power to you. But early in the season, they describe it as the crown of Morgoth. Tolkien's very specific about what happened to the crown of Morgoth. It should not be a little toy that Sauron can play with while dueling with Galadriel. But I think it's time to start wrapping up this video. I would love to spend the rest of the day talking about Tolkien and this show, but I have to get to a press screening for David Cronenberg's The Shrouds up at the New York Film Festival. So just as a way of ending this show on a positive note, at least it's given me the excuse to talk about fantasy for the last few weeks on this channel. It's given me the excuse to go back and reread a lot of Tolkien's books. So just as a way of wrapping things up with like some recommendations for some good fantasy, that luckily, starting with like the late 1800s to now, whether you're talking about paintings or authors or filmmakers or video game developers, there is a lot of great fantasy to be enjoyed. I've been replaying Baldur's Gate 3 on the PS5, and it's just, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, if you're looking for modern fantasy with a modern sensibility that at the same time has delightful characters, incredible gameplay, an incredible story, gorgeous cinematics, Baldur's Gate 3 is a goddamn masterpiece. Or if you're looking for some contemporary books, the books of Joe Abercrombie, if you like grimdark, you really can't do better than the 9 books in his First Law series. Or check out some Frank Frazetta paintings. Or if you just want some kind of like disposable fun entertainment, like a show like The Legend of Vox Machina on Amazon, probably is the best adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons that we are ever going to see. Like, there is good fantasy out there. You just have to set aside, fucking Willow. You got to set aside that crappy show of The Witcher, and you got to find the good stuff, because the fantasy genre is my favorite genre of storytelling. I love and adore it. I've been reading it and watching it and playing it my entire life, and that will never change. But the older I get, the more I realize just how, like, the bad stuff is just beneath contempt, but the good stuff shines a little brighter every day. And I continue to discover new writers. I recently started reading Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. I'm only 2 books in, and apparently the best is yet to come. But that is modern day urban fantasy, basically wizards and vampires and monsters, but in Chicago in the present day. And it's basically like, what if Philip Marlowe was a wizard? Like, that's the best way I can pitch it. And it's just, it's an absolute blast. Yeah, if you like the fantasy genre, Film and television will nearly always frustrate you, but if you are willing to read a book, holy shit, the shelves are breaking under the weight of all the great fantasy literature out there. But on that note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. Thanks for sticking with me throughout this season and my commentary about this show. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you weren't turned off by my negativity, but goddamn, this show just fucking sucks balls. I know I'm not putting it that eloquently, but at a certain point, you just got to say, this show sucks ass, sucks balls, sucks whatever orifice or genitalia you could possibly think of, but it just fucking sucks. And on that note, I'm going to wrap up this video. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Hope everybody has a great weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.